No, this argument just gets you to the existence of God as the sufficient reason for the existence of the universe, but it doesn't say anything about his motivation. I would respond to that again from the standpoint of theology. If you think of God as a self-sufficient being who has no need of anything outside himself, there cannot be any need that he had to satisfy in order to create the universe. We shouldn't think of God as being lonely or needing company, and therefore he made creatures to be his companions or anything. So given that God is a perfect, self-sufficient being, the only reason that I can think for his producing creatures would be for the benefit of the creatures themselves. It would be to create finite persons in his image who are capable of coming into relationship with himself, the fount of all goodness and infinite value and love and truth, and allowing these finite persons to have the privilege of knowing him as the highest good, so that creation would be for the benefit and the sake of the creatures, not for the sake and benefit of the Creator. So that on this view, creation, like salvation, is completely by grace alone. It would be completely by grace that creation takes place.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So I worry about number one, and I think about why we might find it plausible in the first place. And so I think it does have a lot of original plausibility. You see things, and you wonder, well, how did that happen, and why is that there, as you sort of go about your day. Everything we see on a daily basis seems to be created. But then, as we find out more about the way the world works and its sort of the scientific details about subatomic particles, it seems like the more you find out, the weirder things get.
Yep.
And as the weirder things get, it seems like I'm less inclined to think that there needs to be an explanation of those things, because the kinds of things that we're talking about are very different. So between regular, ordinary objects and subatomic objects, it seems like they're really very different, and so different that maybe number one doesn't apply to, say, subatomic objects.
Yeah.
And likewise, I think actually as you scale up, number one also might not apply, or at least my inclination to apply number one to the whole universe kind of goes away as I start thinking bigger and bigger.
Uh-huh. Well, I've already given my response to the second part of that question, and that is just increasing the size of the object. I just can't see anything in that that would remove the need for or satisfy the demand for an explanation. Now, with respect to quantum events or subatomic events, notice that this is deliberately formulated to try to avoid saying that every event has an explanation. This is entirely consistent with there being events that are purely random or uncaused or the product of free will or something of this sort. What this is talking about is that things that exist have to have an explanation for their being, and that is not violated in quantum physics. The quantum vacuum, which underlies all of physical reality, is a sea of fluctuating energy and is the cause for things like virtual particles that arise out of the vacuum, have a brief existence, and then disappear back into the vacuum again. So that even on indeterministic accounts of quantum events, it isn't the case that things exist that have no explanation of their being. Quite the contrary. Moreover, I want to add this, that although the equations, the mathematics of quantum mechanics has been fantastically verified to an incredible degree of accuracy, there are at least 10 different physical interpretations of the mathematics that I can think of, and most of those are thoroughly deterministic. It's only interpretations like the Copenhagen interpretation, which has indeterminism in it, that is really ontological rather than epistemic. So that most of the interpretations, most of the physical interpretations of quantum mechanics are thoroughly deterministic and would present no problem at all to every event or every thing that exists having an explanation. And nobody knows which of these 10 interpretations, if any, is correct. Indeed, many physicists are very dissatisfied with what's sometimes called the mumbo-jumbo, the Copenhagen interpretation, precisely because of the sort of quantum weirdness that you described. We're not by any means committed by the evidence or by the mathematical formalism to this kind of weird Copenhagen interpretation. There are other interpretations that are completely deterministic. And so there's nothing in experimental science that would force us to, or even cause us to think that premise one is not true.
And to someone whose inclination to accept premise one decreases at different sizes, would you just say that they're not being consistent?
Yes, I'm not sure what more I could say to someone like that, except maybe to try to do it as I did in a sort of gradualist way. And I think they would find themselves in a very difficult situation of saying, well, when does the object become big enough that it no longer needs an explanation? Or at what centimeter increase will it cross that line? And then challenge him to tell me something about the object that now makes it in need of an explanation that it didn't have before. And I hope that would elicit enough discomfort in the person to say, why am I being so skeptical and digging in my heels about this? This ought to be the default position. I think the default position is that things have explanations, unless you can give some good reason as to why it doesn't have or can't have an explanation.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So looking at premise number one, the reason you gave that the universe has to have an external cause and cannot necessarily exist is because it seems to have been, it's expanding and it seems to have been created at a moment that it did not exist and then it existed, hence it can't necessarily exist.
Almost. I gave actually two reasons why I think that the universe doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature. My first one was based upon the fact that it seems that everything in the universe is contingent, including the quarks of which it's made, and that therefore it seems obvious that a different collection of quarks could exist than those that do. The atheist would have to say not simply that the universe exists necessarily, but that every single quark exists by a necessity of its own nature, and that just seems crazy to me. That was the first argument, based upon the composition of the universe. The second one was the fact that any necessarily existing being has to exist eternally. And therefore, if something begins to exist, that shows that it could fail to exist and therefore is not necessary in its being. I wouldn't put that as you did, where you said something like you said the universe didn't exist and then it did. It's more radical than that, because there isn't any then prior to the existence of the universe. This is the beginning of time itself. So there is no before at which the universe did not exist. It's rather that the universe came into existence along with space and time a finite time ago.
Okay, then if I may, I guess I'll just change the example that I thought
Sure.
of. That was what I wanted to clarify. I was trying to think of a reason that the universe might necessarily exist, but now I think I just have an idea for why it might have eternally existed. So think about perhaps if all the black holes in the universe eventually swallow up all the matter in the universe, and then they swallow up each other, and everything is reduced to a singularity.
Yes.
Right. This is probably going to happen. Then perhaps at that moment, a force can be created that would cause it all to expand again, just like it did in the Big Bang.
Mhm.
And this would mean that perhaps for that moment, time is again included, but then time would come to be again. And this may have happened before our Big Bang, such that the universe may be doing this over and over again, contracting and expanding, contracting and expanding. So then there wouldn't have to be the explanation of an external cause to create it out of nothing.